The letter arrived on a Tuesday, smelling faintly of cedar and old paper, and it changed the course of my life so completely that I have never since trusted the mail. I was 26 years old that autumn, living in a rented room above a dressmaker's shop in Boston, working as a typist for a shipping firm on Atlantic Avenue, and counting myself fortunate to have steady work in a year when so many did not. My name is Eleanor Vance, though everyone who knew me then called me Nell, and I tell you this story not because I expect you to believe all of it, but because I promised myself, on the night I left that house for the last time, that I would set it down honestly, word for word, exactly as it happened. The letter was from a lawyer in the town of Ashford Hollow, a place I had never heard of, somewhere in the hill country of western Massachusetts. It informed me, in the dry and bloodless language lawyer's favor, that my great-aunt Caroline Whitfield had died in her sleep at the age of 81, and that I, her only living relation, had inherited her property, a house called Hollowmere. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, smelling faintly of cedar and old paper, and it changed the course of my life so completely that I have never since trusted the mail. I was 26 years old that autumn, living in a rented room above a dressmaker's shop in Boston, working as a typist for a shipping firm on Atlantic Avenue, and counting myself fortunate to have steady work in a year when so many did not. My name is Eleanor Vance, though everyone who knew me then called me Nell, and I tell you this story not because I expect you to believe all of it, but because I promised myself, on the night I left that house for the last time, that I would set it down honestly, word for word, exactly as it happened. The letter was from a lawyer in the town of Ashford Hollow, a place I had never heard of, somewhere in the hill country of western Massachusetts. It informed me, in the dry and bloodless language lawyer's favor, that my great-aunt Caroline Whitfield had died in her sleep at the age of 81, and that I, her only living relation, had inherited her property, a house called Hollowmere. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, smelling faintly of cedar and old paper, and it changed the course of my life so completely that I have never since trusted the mail. I was 26 years old that autumn, living in a rented room above a dressmaker's shop in Boston, working as a typist for a shipping firm on Atlantic Avenue, and counting myself fortunate to have steady work in a year when so many did not. My name is Eleanor Vance, though everyone who knew me then called me Nell, and I tell you this story not because I expect you to believe all of it, but because I promised myself, on the night I left that house for the last time, that I would set it down honestly, word for word, exactly as it happened. The letter was from a lawyer in the town of Ashford Hollow, a place I had never heard of, somewhere in the hill country of western Massachusetts. It informed me, in the dry and bloodless language lawyer's favor, that my great-aunt Caroline Whitfield had died in her sleep at the age of 81, and that I, her only living relation, had inherited her property, a house called Hollowmere. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, smelling faintly of cedar and old paper, and it changed the course of my life so completely that I have never since trusted the mail. I was 26 years old that autumn, living in a rented room above a dressmaker's shop in Boston, working as a typist for a shipping firm on Atlantic Avenue, and counting myself fortunate to have steady work in a year when so many did not. My name is Eleanor Vance, though everyone who knew me then called me Nell, and I tell you this story not because I expect you to believe all of it, but because I promised myself, on the night I left that house for the last time, that I would set it down honestly, word for word, exactly as it happened. The letter was from a lawyer in the town of Ashford Hollow, a place I had never heard of, somewhere in the hill country of western Massachusetts. It informed me, in the dry and bloodless language lawyer's favor, that my great-aunt Caroline Whitfield had died in her sleep at the age of 81, and that I, her only living relation, had inherited her property, a house called Hollowmere, along with 40 acres of land, a modest sum of money, and The lawyer's letter specified this with peculiar emphasis. All contents therein, as enumerated in the attached inventory, none of which are to be removed from the premises prior to your arrival. I had never met Caroline Whitfield. My mother spoke of her rarely, and always with a kind of careful blankness, the way one speaks of a relative who has done something faintly shameful. When I was a girl, I once asked why we never visited Aunt Caroline, and my mother's face had gone the color of skimmed milk. Some people, she said, are better loved from a distance. She would say no more, and I, being young and easily distracted, did not press her. My mother had passed 2 years before the letter came, my father a decade before that. I had no brothers or sisters. So when the lawyer's letter arrived, offering me a house and land and money I badly needed, I did not hesitate long. I gave notice at the shipping firm, packed 2 trunks, and took the train west, then a coach the final 11 miles, for Ashford Hollow had no railway station of its own and seemed, the closer I came to it, to want none. The town itself was unremarkable, a single main street, a white clapboard church, a general store, perhaps 30 houses scattered along roads that climbed and dipped through hills thick with maple and birch. It was October, and the hills were on fire with color, scarlet and gold and a deep, bruised orange, so that my first sight of the place, from the top of the coach road, struck me as almost unbearably beautiful. The coachman, an old man named Burke with a face like a dried apple, grew quieter the further we went. When I told him my destination, he was silent for a long moment before he spoke. "Hollowmere," he said, as though testing the word for soundness. "You're the niece, then. Heard she'd left it to someone. Great niece," I said. "I never met her." "No," he said. "Folks didn't much, not these last years." He did not elaborate, and something in his tone discouraged me from asking him to. We came to the house at dusk, which I would later understand was the worst possible hour to arrive anywhere in Ashford Hollow, for dusk in that country has a way of arriving early and lingering long, as if reluctant to surrender the land to either day or night. Hollowmere stood apart from the village, perhaps 2 miles distant, at the end of a lane so overgrown with brambles that Burke would not drive his horse past the gate. The house itself was a tall, narrow structure of gray stone and dark timber, 3 stories, with a steep slate roof and a scattering of gables that gave it the look of a creature half asleep, one eye open. Behind it, I could see the dark line of a pond, the mere of the name, I supposed, ringed with willows that had grown wild and shaggy, trailing their branches in water the color of strong tea. "This is as far as I go," Burke said, setting my trunks down at the gate with more haste than courtesy. When I asked if he might at least carry them to the door, he shook his head, climbed back onto his seat, and was gone before I had even lifted the first trunk myself. I want to be clear that I felt, in that first moment, no particular dread. I was tired from travel, irritated by Burke's rudeness, and mostly concerned with the practical business of getting my trunks up a weed-choked path before full dark. It was only later, lying awake in an unfamiliar bed, that I would understand the old man's haste for what it was. The house was not locked. The lawyer, a Mr. Aldous Pratt, had written that the housekeeper would be expecting me, and indeed, when I pushed open the heavy front door, a woman was waiting in the hall, a single oil lamp held before her, though electric wires, I would later learn, ran to every room in the house, untouched, unused, as if the previous occupant had distrusted the very idea of electric light. "Miss Vance." The woman's voice was low and even. She was perhaps 60, dressed in unrelieved black, with gray hair drawn back so severely it seemed to pull at the corners of her eyes. "I am Mrs. Praxton. I kept house for your aunt 11 years, and I'll keep it for you, if you've a mind to stay." I thanked her, though something in her phrasing, "if you've a mind to stay," settled uneasily in my stomach. She showed me through the house that evening, lamp held high, and I confess that even in my exhaustion I was struck by its strangeness. The rooms were furnished well, even richly, good Persian carpets, dark mahogany furniture, heavy velvet drapes. But every mirror in the house, and there were many, had been turned to face the wall or covered entirely with black cloth. Aunt Caroline did not care for mirrors. I asked, attempting lightness. Mrs. Praxton did not smile. No, miss, she did not. In the dining room, a portrait hung above the mantel, a young woman in a high, colored gown of pale blue silk, dark-haired, with eyes of so light a gray they seemed almost silver in the lamplight. The artist had caught something in her expression I could not quite name, not sorrow exactly, nor fear, but a kind of watchful patience, as if she were waiting for something to happen just beyond the frame. Who is this? I asked. Mrs. Praxton's lamp wavered very slightly. That is your great-aunt, miss. As a young woman, I looked again at the portrait, then at the housekeeper. She was very beautiful. She was, Mrs. Praxton agreed, and moved the lamp on, leading me up the stairs before I could ask anything further. My room? Which had been my aunt's own room? I would later discover, though Mrs. Praxton did not tell me this that first night, was at the end of the upstairs hall, overlooking the dark pond and the willows beyond. The bed was a great four-poster, hung with curtains of faded green damask. A small fire had been laid in the grate, and beside it stood a writing desk of black walnut, locked, its key nowhere in evidence. Breakfast is at 8, Mrs. Praxton said, setting the lamp upon the mantel. I sleep in the cottage by the kitchen garden, miss, not in the main house. If you should need anything in the night, I'm afraid you'll have to manage till morning. This struck me as an odd arrangement for a housekeeper, but I was too wary to question it, and said only that I was sure I would sleep soundly. Mrs. Praxton looked at me for a moment with an expression I could not read, something between pity and apology, and then bid me good night, and was gone, taking the lamp's light with her down the stairs, until I heard the front door close, and then nothing at all but the wind moving through the willows by the pond. I did not sleep soundly. I want to set down honestly what I experienced that first night, without embellishment, for I have learned since that the embellishments people add to such stories, the creaking doors, the cold spots, the disembodied moans, are almost always inventions laid atop something far stranger and more difficult to describe, a wrongness in the quality of silence itself. I woke sometime after midnight. I could not say precisely when, for the clock on the landing had stopped. I would later discover at 17 minutes past 2 and had been stopped, Mrs. Praxton told me, for as long as she had worked in the house. I woke to the absolute certainty that I was not alone in the room. This was not a vague unease. It was a specific, located certainty, the kind one has when another person enters a room behind you, even before you hear their footstep. I lay rigid beneath the blankets, my heart beating so hard I could feel it in my throat, and I made myself turn my head toward the foot of the bed. There was a woman standing there. I do not know how long she had been standing there before I woke, nor how long she stood after. She was dressed in pale blue, the same gown as the portrait downstairs, though in the darkness of the room it seemed to hold its own faint luminescence, as if the silk had absorbed moonlight and now slowly released it. Her hair was dark and unbound, falling past her shoulders. Her face I could not see clearly. It remained throughout in a kind of soft shadow that no shift of my eyes could resolve. But I had the unshakable impression that she was looking at me, and that she had been looking at me for some time, with that same watchful patience I had seen in the painted eyes downstairs. I did not scream. I want to record this honestly, because I have since wondered at my own silence. I think in truth, I was too afraid even for that, afraid that screaming might provoke some response I could not survive, that silence as the only safety available to me. I lay frozen watching her watch me, for what felt an immense span of time, though when I later compared notes against the stopped clock and the position of the moon through my window, I believe it cannot have been more than a few minutes. Then, quite simply, she was not there. There was no fading, No dissolving into mist of the kind one reads of in cheap ghost stories. One moment the space at the foot of my bed held a woman in pale blue silk. The next moment it held only shadow and the dim shapes of the bedposts. I lay awake the rest of that night with every lamp I could find lit around me and did not sleep again until gray daylight had fully claimed the room. I said nothing to Mrs. Praxton at breakfast, partly from a stubborn unwillingness to seem the kind of overwrought young woman who imagines things in strange houses, and partly, I think, from a deeper fear that if I spoke the thing aloud, I would make it more real than I could yet bear. But Mrs. Praxton, setting down a plate of eggs and toast before me, looked at my face, pale I am sure and hollow-eyed from sleeplessness, and said, without preamble, "You saw her then." I set down my fork. "I don't know what I saw." "You saw her." Mrs. Praxton sat across from me, which she had not done the evening before, and folded her hands upon the table. "I'll not insult you by pretending otherwise, Miss Vance. Everyone who sleeps in that room sees her, sooner or later. Your aunt saw her every night of her life, by her own telling, for 60 years. I asked, my voice steadier than I felt, who the woman was. "Her name was Hester Whitfield," Mrs. Praxton said. "Your aunt's elder sister. She would have been your great-aunt, I suppose, though I confess I've never been certain how such things are reckoned." I had never heard the name. My mother had spoken of Caroline rarely and unhappily, but never once, in all my childhood, had I heard mention of a sister. Mrs. Praxton told me the story as she understood it, though she was careful to say that much of it came to her secondhand, pieced together over 11 years from things your aunt let slip in low moments, and old letters I was not, strictly, meant to read. Hester and Caroline Whitfield had been raised in this house by a father, their mother having died young, who was, by every account, a hard and possessive man, a country judge of some local reputation, who could not abide the thought of either daughter marrying and leaving Hollowmere. Hester, the elder by 3 years, was by far the more beautiful, the more sought after. In the spring of 1864, with the war still raging to the south, she had fallen in love with a young man named Thomas Earl, the son of a neighboring farmer, and the two had planned to elope, for her father would never have consented to the match. What happened to her? I asked, though some part of me already suspected the shape of the answer, the way one suspects rain from the smell of the air before the first drop falls. "She drowned," Mrs. Praxton said, "in the Mere, the night she was meant to meet her young man and run for it. The story your aunt told, and I cannot say how much of it is true, for I have only her word, and she was not always a reliable teller of her own history, was that her father discovered the plan, and that there was a confrontation at the water's edge, and that Hester went into the pond and did not come out." "You mean he killed her?" Mrs. Praxton's mouth tightened. "I mean only what I was told, Miss Vance. The official record says it was an accident. A young woman out walking on a dark night, a misstep on wet ground. Thomas Earl left Ashford Hollow within the month and was never heard from again in these parts. The judge lived another 20 years in this house and never once, by all accounts, spoke his elder daughter's name again. And Caroline inherited the house upon her father's death and lived in it alone. But for myself, these last 11 years, until the night she died, she never married. She never, so far as I know, left Ashford Hollow for more than a week at a stretch in all her 81 years. And she saw her sister every night, in that room you slept in last night, which was the room they shared as girls. I asked, somewhat desperately, why no one had simply moved out of that room, sealed it, abandoned the house entirely. Mrs. Praxton was quiet for a long moment. "Your aunt believed," she said finally, "that Hester was waiting for something, that she could not rest until it was given to her, and I believe, though your aunt never said so outright, not in plain words, that she felt it her duty to remain in this house, in that room, until she could discover what that something was and provide it. She looked at me with an expression of great wariness. I do not know if she ever succeeded, miss. She died before she told me, if she knew at all. I will not pretend that I considered, even for a moment, simply selling the house and returning to Boston without further investigation. I have asked myself many times since why I did not do the sensible thing, and the truest answer I can give is this: from the moment Mrs. Praxton finished her account, I felt myself caught by something larger than curiosity, a sense of obligation to a dead woman I had never known, who had spent 60 years of her life keeping faithful, lonely vigil over a sister she could not save and could not release. I spent that day exploring the house in full daylight, which proved a far less unsettling exercise than I had feared, though I noted with interest that every clock in the house, not merely the one on the landing, had stopped at the same hour, 17 minutes past 2. Mrs. Praxton could not say why, only that it had been so since before her own time in the house began. It was in the library, going through my aunt's papers at Mr. Pratt's request, for there were estate matters to settle and old correspondence to be sorted, that I found the key. It was a small brass key, old and tarnished, tucked into the spine of a Bible on the highest shelf, in a place no casual searcher would think to look. I recognized at once, from its shape, that it must belong to the locked writing desk in my room. Hester's room, I now understood it to be, though it had been given to me as though it were any ordinary guest chamber. That evening, after Mrs. Praxton had retired to her cottage, I took a lamp and the key upstairs, my heart beating with an unease I could not fully separate from anticipation. The desk's lock was stiff with dessous, but yielded after a moment's working, and inside I found what I can only describe as the private archive of a young woman's last days of freedom, pressed flowers gone to brown dust, a handful of letters tied with faded ribbon, and a small leather-bound diary with the initials H.W. stamped in flaking gold upon its cover. I sat upon the bed and read by lamplight until the small hours, and I will not transcribe the whole of it here, for much of it concerns matters too private and too sorrowful to set down for strangers' eyes. A young woman's hopes for a marriage and a life beyond her father's house, her fears of discovery, her tender and entirely unremarkable love for a young farmer named Thomas. But the final entry, dated the very day of her death, I will record, for it bears directly upon what followed. Papa knows. I am certain of it now. He has watched me too closely these 3 days, and this morning he asked, with that terrible quiet voice he uses when he means to be obeyed, whether I had given thought to Mr. Aldridge's proposal, as though I had not refused it twice already. I am to meet Thomas at the Willows tonight, at the hour we agreed, and we are to go before Papa can prevent it. I have hidden Mother's locket in the hollow oak by the gate, for I dare not be seen carrying anything of value from the house, and I mean to send for it once we are safely away and married, if anything should prevent me from returning for it, though I cannot think what could. I should wish whoever finds these pages to know that it is there, and that it was hers, and that I loved her, and Thomas, and even Caroline, who I fear will have a lonelier house to live in once I am gone. More than I had words to say aloud while I lived. I sat for a long while after reading this, the lamp guttering low, and understood, with the particular cold clarity that comes only at such hours, what Hester Whitfield had been waiting 60 years to ask of someone. I did not sleep that night, and I did not see her, Hester, though I confess I half hoped, half dreaded that I might tell her I understood, that I meant to help. But the room remained empty of anything but shadow and the sound of wind in the willows, and I lay awake until first light, turning the diary's final entry over and over in my mind. In the morning I asked Mrs. Praxton whether she knew of a hollow oak near the gate. She did, though she had never thought much of it. An old, half-dead tree, split by some long-ago lightning strike, that stood just inside the stone wall bordering the lane. I went to it directly after breakfast, diary in hand, and found the hollow easily enough, a deep cavity in the trunk, screened from casual view by a fall of ivy that had clearly grown undisturbed for decades. I reached into it with no small trepidation, half expecting nothing, half expecting I hardly know what. My fingers found, beneath a litter of dead leaves and the husks of old acorns, a small object wrapped in what had once been silk, and was now little more than rotted fiber that crumbled at my touch. Inside was a locket of tarnished silver, oval, on a broken chain. I worked the clasp open with some difficulty and found, within, 2 small portraits, faded nearly to ghosts themselves, a woman I took to be Hester and Caroline's mother on one side, and on the other, a lock of fine, dark hair, tied with a thread gone the color of dust.